Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here. Uh, Actually, I have not come here to speak as a Kashmiri Pandit because I do not uh, see myself as a representative of Kashmiri Pandits. But nevertheless, I'll speak about my personal journey as a journalist, as a writer who's written, among other things, extensively about Kashmir and the cause of Kashmiri Pandits. In the spring of 2003, I was in Jordan as a young war correspondent, along with 2,500 other journalists from all over the world. We were stuck there because the border between Jordan and Iraq was sealed, and most of us did not have visa to enter into Iraq. This is in the middle of the Iraq war. Now, we would pass our time by doing whatever we could in Jordan. There was a constant stream of refugees who would travel from Iraq into Jordan, do a little protest. There were protests in Jordan as well. But mostly there was not much we could do except wait and look for an opportunity to enter into Iraq. And in the course of my few weeks in Jordan, in Amman, in the Jordanian capital, I met this young Palestinian refugee who was born in a camp in Amman. His family had migrated from Palestine long back. And he used to drive a taxi. And in the due course of a few weeks, we became very close friends. So he would come to my hotel every day, pick me up, and we would go to various places wherever my work took me. And he would insist on treating me to a Turkish coffee every afternoon, which he paid for, and so on and so forth. One fine day, I realized that he often sings this to himself, this rather silly ditty in Arabic, which went something like this. Bush, bush, shili dak, hadal hachi maifidak. Since I had a lot of time to kill, there was not much I was doing there. So one day, out of curiosity, I asked him what this ditty meant. So he would speak in broken English, and he said, this roughly means that, Mr. Bush, don't put your hands into Iraq, you'll burn your hands. And since I had a lot of time, we would make fun of this. To much of his irritation, he would get irritated with this. And I would sit in his car and I would start singing this ditty. Bush, bush, lidak, hadal hachi mai fidak. After a few weeks, a friend of mine who came from another country, she bribed a Jordanian border official, and they agreed to let 3 of us pass through the Jordanian border into Iraq. And this is the time when Mr. Saddam Hussein was still in power. And they made us sign an undertaking that the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan is not in any way responsible for our safety. And in journalism, they say there's a very thin line between guts and stupidity. I don't know what it was, but we signed that undertaking and we crossed the border from the Jordanian side, and we crossed this small patch of land called the No Man's Land. And lo and behold, we are right there at the Al-Karama border, and there's a huge statue of Mr. Saddam Hussein right there, and immediately we are surrounded by the Iraqi Republican Guards. Now, in due course of time in Jordan, we have picked up a few Arabic phrases and words, and we try to communicate with them. So I say, Sahafi, Sahafi, which in Arabic and Urdu both means that you are a journalist. And you say tasweer, we're going there to click some pictures, report, etc. And they ask for our passport, which we have, but obviously there's no visa, there's no Iraqi visa on the passport. And suddenly, in a matter of few minutes, the chief of this small group of Republican guards comes to us, and he throws our passports away, and he gets very hostile suddenly. And he's shouting, which I guess were expletives in Arabic. And suddenly we are surrounded by these Republican guards, and they start cocking their AK-47 rifles. And I look at my friend. The blood from her whole face is drained, and it has gone to her ears, and they're pulsating like that of a rabbit. And suddenly and we thought, we'll be killed now because, that's what they do. And suddenly, out of some divine intervention, I started singing this silly Arabic ditty which I'd learned from Muhammad. And the first reaction was that the AK-47s came down and the chief started rolling on the floor on the road with laughter. In the next half an hour, he called people from all over the neighboring villages and made me sing this ditty about 100, 150 times. By the time I was so frustrated, I said, if he asks me to sing this again, I'll say, just put a bullet through my head and, I'll be all right. But thankfully, that ditty saved our life. They did not let us cross into Iraq. There was a vehicle coming from Jordan back into Iraq. They forcibly made us sit into it. They thankfully gave our passports back to us. And we were thrown back into Jordan. Now, 3 years later, we crossed into Iraq and we stayed there for some time. That's another story. But when I came back, after spending some time in Iraq, I came back to Jordan, to the safety of Jordan. I realized that I was so stressed that I'd forgotten the the PIN number of my ATM card. Now, it may not be a big thing for you, but it's a very big deal for me, for someone like me who's a John Nash kind of fascination with numbers. I mean, I still remember my high school examination roll number. It was 616564. So for many years, this particular incident became my identity. I was this one journalist, this gutsy or stupid journalist, depending on your point of view, who's perhaps saved his life by singing this silly Arabic ditty. But many people ask me, they say, why do you go to a place like Iraq and put yourself into a situation like this? Why do you go to Bastar? Why do you go to Bastar, which is the epicenter of this vicious battle between the Maoist guerrillas and the Indian state? Why do you travel weeks through this snake-infested territory where you can very easily get 2 very deadly strains of malaria? Why do you throw yourself into the snake pit where you do not know who is who's a police agent, who's a Maoist sympathizer, whether you'll get killed with a landmine blast or whether you'll get killed in a police ambush? And I do not have any perfect answer for this, except the fact that I think this stems from my empathy for people who have been caught in circumstances similar to what I have gone through many years ago as a refugee from Kashmir. So when I was 14, my family, like hundreds of thousands of others, was forced out of Kashmir Valley by Islamist extremism. And we became refugees overnight, 26 years back. My grandfather used to say that Kashmir is so beautiful that even the gods are jealous of it. So I was born in a middle-class family in Kashmir. And I do not know whether my parents harbored any great worldly ambition, except the fact that they had to run this household in a very middle-class sort of way, which means that you go to work, you come back at .6, a ring that orange-colored, fish-shaped doorbell, make sure that your kids are doing the homework, the kitchen is up and running, the larder is full, the winter clothes are accounted for. This is the place where I was born, this lovely house built by my parents in a upcoming suburb in Srinagar. The Libyan writer Hisham Matar's father used to tell him that Rome is for people who know exactly what they want from life and are absolutely comfortable with it. And New York is for people who have no idea what they want from life. So in my case, I think for my parents, for us, Kashmir was like Rome. Now, my father had exactly no idea about fixed deposits or mutual funds or Indira Vikas Patras or Kisan Vikas Patras. But I think this idea of home was very important for him, like any other middle-class family. So whatever my parents earned, or whatever they managed to save, was put into this house. So in a way, this house became their identity. Now, when you're very young, of course, you do not care about such things. So all we knew about is that Kashmir is a very special place. It's very different from the rest of the country because sometime in the evening, a couple of old people in the neighborhood get together. They are smoking a hookah. They look at the sky during the sunset. And if the sky has turned crimson, they get worried about it and say, oh, I think bloodshed or Khoon Rezi has happened somewhere. It is also the place where they said that the great Shankaracharya was defeated in Arthashastra by a housewife. There was also a friend whose father was a communist, and he used to create these memorials of toffee and candy when the Russian Premier Leonid Brezhnev came visiting us in India in the early 80s. So this is the kind of place I was born in. So obviously, beyond this, I had no idea about identity. I remember when I was very young, one of my mother's cousins came visiting us. Now, he was one of those weird uncles whose favorite pastime is to quiz other people's children about stuff like, which is the largest rice-producing nation in the world? Or what is A plus B ka whole square? And he asked me a question. He said, what is your father? And I thought about it for a moment, and I said, my father is a human being. But that's not the answer he expected. He gave me his wicked smile, and he said, no, you should have said, my father is a government servant. And then he mumbled in the same breath, he said, I think my kids know more than you do. But, you had no idea about who you are. But later, when you grew up a little, you became very conscious of your identity as a Kashmiri Pandit because people would tell you that you belong to this minority community. And even in school, you cannot beat up a Muslim kid even if you can, because he's supposedly from majority community and you can't do that. So things moved on. Fastly from here, and in a matter of few weeks, in 1990, everything we had in Kashmir was lost. We were thrown into this exile. Our first summer in the plains of Jammu in the summer of 1990 was like a blow of hammer on our heads. We lost everything. Our identity was reduced to a ration card, which became like a citizenship paper for us. Obviously, it was very difficult for the people of my parent generation and my grandparent generation because they had spent their youth in Kashmir, formidable years in Kashmir. So it was very, very difficult for them. And suddenly you were thrust in this place where even the language you spoke was alien. So for many years, we, as Kashmiris, we did not live in Bharat, but we lived in Bharat. And we never lost our ghar, we lost our gar. And finally when I came to Delhi, I learned Hindi working in a TV channel and traveling in DTC buses. So that's what happened to us in 1990 in exile. And suddenly one fine day you call yourself, you become a refugee, your identity is restricted to this ration card. Obviously my mother, for example, in those days had developed her own mechanism to deal with this loss of home, etc. She got into this habit of saying, she would take a stroll in the garden, in the neighborhood park, and anyone who met her there, she would say, my house in Kashmir had 22 rooms. So that one statement became like a precious stone in the mosaic of her identity. Now, as a teenager, I did not care much about exile except the fact that I wanted a little bit of privacy. I longed for a Walkman where I could just put it on and listen to the songs of the movie Ashiki, which was a rage in those days. But obviously, I could not do that. And this small city, it was very stifling. And the only thing I wanted in those days was to get out of this. And finally, with that anger, I managed to get out of the city and completed my college, etc., and came to Delhi in the late 90s. Now, when I came to Delhi, Delhi was the new country as opposed to the old country which Kashmir was. It was very harsh. In the new country, in 1978, a criminal duo called Ranga Bila had murdered the brother sisters, the young brother sisters Sanjay and Geeta Chopra. But in the old country, in Kashmir, even till mid-80s, 7 or 8 years after the incident, they would still talk about the fact that this criminal duo had murdered Ranga Bila. Now, this new country, Delhi, was very harsh. And they said, they called it being practical or being professional. A friend of mine who used to work with me in a TV company where Radhika and I worked together, he used to say that I have so many knives in my back that I can cut my birthday cakes with them for the rest of my life. so that is, but you learn. I mostly learned from women I fell in love with. They told me about this little weird thing which is in the middle of that plastic thing which is in the middle of a pizza. They taught me that you're not supposed to wear sneakers with formal trousers. They taught me that when you do not ask someone whether you had lunch, you're supposed to say, did you have your grub? And stuff like that. I learned that from the women I fell in love with. But somehow that inner grain which the old country gave me remained with me. I was more of Sahir than Led Zeppelin. And with this anger, what I had gone through in Kashmir and in the aftermath of exile, it is with the same intensity I did my journalism. So in the 90s and early 2000s when I started my journalism, most of the journalists here in Delhi would go to Kashmir for reporting because Kashmir was, quote unquote, the sexy insurgency. Since I was an affected party in Kashmir, I went to Bastar because when I was in college, I was introduced to a few radical students in my college, and they led me to Bastar. So obviously, when you move in that the whole corridor, I remember one incident where I was traveling through Orissa in this corridor called the KBK corridor, Kalahandi, Bolangir, Koraput corridor. And I was traveling with a guide, and I met this middle-aged man who I was told had lost his son the previous week. So I got to speak to him. He would speak in broken Hindi, and I spoke to him directly without the assistance of my guide. I said, मैंने सुना है आपका बेटा मरा. He said, yeah, जी साहब, he died the previous week. So I thought, I said, how did he die? He said, उनको बीमारी था. So I thought, maybe, because malnutrition is rampant there, and you have typhoid, malaria, etc. Maybe he's died of one of these ailments. And he said something which gave me absolute goosebumps, and I did not know how to deal with that information. He said, नहीं, उनको भूख का बीमारी था. So he was suffering from a disease called hunger. When I came back, armed with this information to my editors, they did not understand this. They refused to accept the fact that in some parts of India, people are so resigned to their fate, even after so many years of independence, that they treat hunger as a disease. I would tell my friends about it, especially friends who worked for pink newspapers, and they would throw back these numbers at me. They would talk about stuff like inclusive growth, trillion-dollar economy, etc. But from mid-2004 onwards, when the Maoist insurgency became very big and it started hurting the nation, so much so that the former Prime Minister had to call it India's biggest internal security threat, then they realized what was happening. I also steered clear from what I call the clean bedsheet journalism, where the editors send a journalist to the nearest town where he gets into the area, does a couple of quotes, gets what the editors call the color, and then always has the luxury to come back to this to this hotel, small hotel, somewhere in the town. That's why I call it green bedsheet journalism. But in my heart, I still remain that old country which I was talking to you about. There is something which happens to someone who's in exile, who's lost his home, who is uprooted. The German mystic Jakob Boehme used to call it Ungrund. Ungrund as in the non-ground. You are on ground, but it is not a ground really. You are on a non-ground, and you're constantly treading that. Non-ground. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't know what my identity is. I think it's a sum total of many things I do. I'm a war correspondent. I love Sahir's poetry. I'm an ultra cyclist. I'm a David Foster Wallace scholar. But that apart, there's this, someone said that exile brings with it a sadness that cannot be unsurmounted. And I think that sadness is very much a part of my identity. And there's another identity I have. My friends also know me as this person who only knows 3 English songs. One is Hotel California, one is Summer of '69, and one is Who the Fuck is Alice?